Welcome, everyone. Welcome. My name is Leah. I'm the Director of Knowledge Exchange at Women's Shelters Canada. As you know, we are here today to hear more about Women's Shelters Canada's new report, Sheltering Under Pressure: Frontline Realities of Canada's VAW Shelters and Transition Houses. So just to let you know how we're going to move through the program, in just a moment, I'm going to pass it over to Anuradha Dugal, the Executive Director of Women's Shelters Canada, for some opening remarks. And then we'll hear from Lisa Gibbs, the Executive Director of the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation, the funder of this work, to talk a bit about how important it is and why they're supporting it. And then we'll pass it over to WSC's research team, Robin Hugendam and Chika Maduakolam. And they're going to really dive deep into the report, the findings, the recommendations, the advocacy guide, and share all of that with you. We'll have a couple poll questions throughout. We'll pause for questions, and hopefully this can be a really great interactive session. And I will say as well, we are recording. We will share the recording afterwards, and we'll share a copy of the presentation slides. So don't worry about noting everything down as we go. And so without further ado, I will pass things over to Anuradha.
Thank you, Leah. Hello, everyone. So nice to see you, or at least see your names pop up in the chat. It's wonderful to see people from so many different places. As Leah mentioned, my name is Anuradha Dugal. I'm the Executive Director of Women's Shelters Canada. And I'd like to start with a brief land acknowledgement, knowing that we are all joining from many different territories, whether they are treaty territories or whether they are unceded land. I am calling in today from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, and we always want to acknowledge their stewardship in this little island, as it is called, and the area that I am calling in from is colonially known as Ottawa. So thank you, many thanks for the stewardship of this land. So the national report, Sheltering Under Pressure: Frontline Realities of Canada's Violence Against Women's Shelters and Transition Houses, provides current national and widely ranging information on the state of the shelters in Canada for women, children, and gender diverse people fleeing violence. This report has been over a year in the making, and I have been absolutely thrilled to watch its development as Executive Director of Women's Shelters Canada. I want to really extend huge thanks and kudos to our research team, Robin and Chika, who designed the survey. They analyzed the results, they wrote the report, and many other members of the WSC team who provided support through feedback, from the very first variation of questions that were on the list that we would be asking shelters, all the way through to edits, design, and promotion of this incredible webinar that we're able to provide also. It builds very significantly on WSC's historic More Than a Bed report which was released in 2019. It's an update of that national survey, allowing us to track emerging pressures and changes over time and to highlight where investments and policy changes are most urgently needed. As you'll hear today, this report quantifies what we've been hearing anecdotally. It's no surprise to you to hear that shelter workers across Canada are facing the daily reality of doing much, much more with increasingly less. And that's a question of resources, as well as increasing, challenging, complex situations, and space limitations, which is another thing that you'll hear about a lot as this report is unfolded before you. This can feel very isolating. And what we want to also highlight is that these are sector-wide challenges that require policy and systems change, and we're all in this to work together to reach that point. Policy, advocacy, and government relations cannot happen without the data that support positions and the ideas and the processes we propose. So this report will help us on the national level for Women's Shelters Canada. We also want it to help regionally and at the local level so that you can speak to your elected officials, to your funders and other stakeholders and bring this story to them with the backup of this incredible data. We will continue to advocate for sector changes that support shelters and ultimately the survivors and the people they serve. This includes, and you'll hear more about this from us many, many more times in the coming year. This includes working towards the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence, so that we have a coherent national framework acknowledging shelters as central pillars of Canada's social and justice systems, as well as partners in advancing gender equality, reconciliation, and all of our rights. So we wouldn't be able to do this work without the partnership of the funder of this project, Royal LePage Shelter Foundation, and the belief that its executive director, Lisa Gibbs, has offered to Women's Shelters Canada as a long-time supporter. Lisa and the foundation she works with understand the incredible importance of data and research, which is something that not all funders do. And as you know, and we are always very conscious of, philanthropy is an essential complement to all the other funding that we're able to get, whether it's from governments or individuals. So thank you, Lisa, and your team for your support of Women's Shelters Canada and for this project. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anu. When I consider those that operate and lead women's shelters and transition houses in Canada, your voices represent the future of this sector, day after day, week after week, and year after year. When I was writing feasibility reports on family violence, a name for the issue back in the late 80s, or working in a shelter in the early 90s, communities worked in silos. Still, the voices of so many of you demanded more. Your strength always resonated as you stood strong for those impacted by this persistent and devastating gender-based violation. Fast forward, and I marvel at the differences since I worked in the sector. The name has changed to intimate partner violence or IPV, and the media now calls it out for what it is, femicide in the most tragic cases. There's awareness that a woman and her children can't heal and move on in a 3 to 6 month time frame, and that second stage transitional housing is imperative. All this and so many more milestones have been realized due to the strength of your collective voices. I also hope you feel pride in recognizing what you and so many others in communities across Canada can do when your voices are heard as a collective. When Women's Shelters Canada presented the opportunity for the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation to fund this report, a collection of your passionate voices, our board of directors knew this was a powerful moment, brimming with opportunity for change, for enhanced capacity, and partnership amongst supporters of the sector. And when I say supporters in this instance, I'm referring to the thousands of Royal LePage agents in communities across Canada who raise considerable dollars for their local shelters and national violence prevention programs. They've been doing this since 1998, literally 28 years, and have raised over $57 million to date for this sector so that you didn't have to and could focus on the issue and those impacted by its darkness. In closing, I hope that next time you feel the considerable weight of this issue on your shoulders, you'll think about Royal LePage, Canada's real estate company, and the support they give to the sector when homes are sold in neighborhoods across Canada. You're not alone in your commitment to the cause. Your voices have strength, and each time you receive funding from Royal LePage Shelter Foundation, you know together we stand in solidarity that home should be a safe place for everyone.
Amazing. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for those inspiring words and for your support of this work. And thank you, Lisa and Anu, for being here today and setting the stage for us. So now I am going to pass things over to Chika to get started with sharing the report. So over to you, Chika, and as well to Robin.
Thank you, Leah, for all the introductions and starting us off so well. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Again, my name is Chika. I'm research coordinator at Women's Shelters Canada. Before we go on, I'd like to acknowledge that I work and live in Toronto, on the traditional territory of many nations, which includes the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Robin and I are glad to share a national picture of the realities facing violence against women's shelters and transition houses across Canada. Um, we hope that in our presentation today, we're able to reflect both the scale of the pressure and the depth of the sector's work. We'll move through the study background and then key findings, then recommendations, followed by a first round of questions. Following that, we will then turn to the advocacy portion of the presentation. So we're happy to have you join us, and I will leave it to Robin now to take us through the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Chika, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. There's so many of you here, and we're really excited to share this research. So I want to thank Inu and Leah for the great intros, and I want to thank Lisa so much for being here and to the Foundation for the funds to do this work. As was mentioned, I'm Robin Hugendam. I'm the Research and Policy Manager at Women's Shelters Canada. I use she, her, and today I'm joining from our office on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This study has been a 2-year undertaking, and so we're really excited to get underway. So as Chika outlined this a little bit, but today we're going to share details and findings from the study, as well as some time talking through the resources that we've created to help you to use this content in your own work. We're going to start by talking about the history of our national study. As Anu mentioned, this was completed in 2019, and we stand on the shoulders of past colleagues like Chris Mackey and Lise Martin, who really moved this work forward. And then we'll move on to some of the learnings from that and how that's influenced our current study. We'll share the findings, and we'll talk through our recommendations that we've developed from this work. And then we'll take a pause. We're going to take some questions in the middle on what you've heard so far. And when we come back from those questions, we're going to talk more about the recommendations and really how you can use this data and this report. So we'll walk through the resources we've created, and in particular through our advocacy guide and how that might be useful to you. And then we'll briefly talk about our advocacy and research directions based on the study, where we're going next, and then we'll have some more time for questions at the end. So before we kick off, we're really honored today to not just be joined by shelters who primarily join us for these events, but we know we have a range of folks who are in the room with us today. So you have a poll on your screen. I'm gesturing at my other screen as if you know that, but you have a poll on your screen. So let us know today where you're joining from. Leah, I'm not able to see where it's moving, so I'll let you tell me when it's slowed down.
For sure. So it looks like most folks have had the chance to answer now. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results back. So hopefully, can you see the results there? Perfect.
Thanks for answering. We do have lots of you joining us from the shelter sector today. Welcome. So excited. A lot of this material today is very much geared towards you and how you might use it. So we're happy to have you. But it's great to see that we have other feminist organizations joining and other nonprofits as well. And welcome to policymakers, public, and to our folks from the academic sector. So without any further, I'm going to jump into some of the background. So in 2017, Women's Shelters Canada launched our first national survey. This was the first Canadian inquiry of its kind developed by and for the violence against women sector. And the hope was to build a profile of the sector and better understand the challenges that our sector was facing. It was also an opportunity to raise awareness about the work of shelters and the work that was done in those spaces, because too often we know people view them as a space to offer a bed, but they don't know all of the work that's done in shelters and transition houses. For that survey, we outreached to shelters from across the country, and the final report was released in 2019. That original survey was approximately 100 questions long, and it took organizations an hour to 1.5 hours to complete. And due to the length, we developed a second, shorter survey, as well as a separate survey that was specific to second stage shelters or transitional houses, because we realized that first survey was missing questions that really targeted the unique work that was happening in those spaces. Since releasing that report, we've seen it used by politicians and bureaucrats. It's been used by academics and those others in civil society. And we've also seen it regularly cited by government agencies. For ourselves at Women's Shelters Canada, we used those study findings to explore two subsequent areas where we'd identified gaps in our knowledge. The first of these was the second stage specific study that was released in 2020. And the second of these was the feminist brain drain study that looked at labor challenges, and that was released in 2024. Beginning in 2024, we started working on the second iteration of the study, and the survey was launched in March 2025. And we took a lot of the learnings from the first study to build on and to improve that process. And in both of these studies, we engaged experts from the shelter community, as well as those from our partner organizations. And that really helped us to improve and build a strong survey. So the learning from our first survey really influenced the design of the second. Firstly, we know we needed to address the amount of time it took to complete the survey. So while it still remained long, I believe it was 109 questions in the end, we included a lot more checkbox answers rather than having open text questions. So we still had some of them, but tried to reduce them. We also were able to look, because we had the previous survey results, we could look at that data and understand which questions had been answered well, which had not been answered well. And from that, we made a lot of changes. Some questions were removed, and in other cases, they were just reworded, but we were able to respond to what had occurred in the first survey. In that first survey, we asked people to provide financial data, and that required a respondent to have their budget sitting in front of them. And we know that that created a barrier to responding to the survey quickly. So, and as a result, we saw that many of those questions were not answered well, or they were skipped, because that was a challenge. So we removed these and we sought alternative financial data sources, and that saved a lot of time for organizations. Finally, we did a scan of emerging or pressing shelter issues, as well as consulting with other shelter experts, including our advisory committee members for the project. And we looked at where we needed to add other issues that shelters are really feeling the challenges of. So from this, we added the themes of pandemic recovery, the climate crisis and emergency management, and substance use and the toxic drug poisonings. We also added several questions specifically related to technology, and those included questions around the tech resources that a shelter has available to them and that they're using, as well as specific questions about tech-facilitated gender-based violence. I'm going to very briefly touch on our methodology. I know we probably don't have lots of people that are super interested in this today, but feel free to ask us more questions. But to undertake this study, we distributed a survey to all shelters through Qualtrics, which is an online survey platform. We did provide alternative methods to answer as well, offering PDFs and working through the questionnaire on the phone to make this more accessible. The survey was open for approximately 3 months. When we received that data, we ran descriptive statistics on all of the quantitative data, and we did thematic analysis on all qualitative responses. Like I said, we're not focused on this today, but happy to answer more questions because that's a very brief touch on our methodology. So before we get into our findings, I'm going to tease you for one more minute, but you should see a poll on the screen, and we're just wondering what you think some of the top, most pressing issues were that we maybe found. And I'll reveal those in a second, and then we'll hand it over to Chika for the full findings.
So the results are starting to come in. I'm going to give folks another moment to read through all the options. And I'll just let folks know too, if anything is, if the poll doesn't pop up just automatically for you, you may need to sort of go into your toolbar at the bottom, and there might be a poll section, or under more, you might have the option to just open it up there. So if you're not seeing it, you can try that. It looks like most folks have answered those, so I will share those results.
I'm looking at the answers, and definitely, they're very similar to what we found. The number one issue, and this was cited by 84% of the respondents, that it was either a major challenge or a minor challenge, was actually rising inflation and cost of living. I think that came out in many ways. The second was that survivors were staying longer in shelter and facing shelter capacity issues. And the third, the largest number you put here, and it comes out in so many ways, was not enough funding, cited by 63% of respondents. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. And now that I've teased you for a bit on what data was coming, I'm going to hand it over to Chika to dive into the results.
Thank you, Robin. So this section gives us the frame for the rest of the report. We heard from 317 shelters, which was a 51% response rate across every province and territory. And the sample included emergency shelters, second stage shelters, mixed shelters, and safe houses. This matters because it means that the report is not focused on just one model of sheltering. It reflects a broad national sector with different roles, different mandates, and different levels of infrastructure. The geographic spread is also important. The responses came from large centers, smaller communities, rural and remote settings, and northern context, which means that the pressures that we will talk about as we go through the findings are not isolated to one region or one type of community. There are some gaps in a few areas, particularly for the second stage shelters and in territorial data. But overall, this is still a strong national snapshot of who participated and whose realities are presented. So this slide is not just about who answered, it's about understanding the reach and the limitations of the evidence base that follows. So one of the most striking findings from the report is how old and under-resourced the physical shelter infrastructure is. The median year of construction for a shelter building is found to be 1981, but that number alone doesn't fully capture what shelters are dealing with. Many buildings are far older, and the report shows extensive need for both major and minor repairs. So what stands out here is the gap between what needs to be done and what can actually be done. More than half of respondents, 53%, stated that they needed repairs but did not have sufficient funds to complete them, which means that buildings are deteriorating while shelters continue to operate inside them. That has practical consequences. When a building needs repairs, accessibility upgrades, security improvements, or basic maintenance, those issues directly shape who can safely access the space and how well the shelter can function. And in remote northern and indigenous communities, this becomes even more urgent because the infrastructure burden is being carried in context where access to capital funding is already uneven. So the finding here is more than the fact that shelters are old. It is that the sector is operating in infrastructure that has not been renewed at the pace required by the need it carries today. So capacity is one of the most important findings from the report because it connects shelter operations to the broader housing crisis. Emergency shelters are operating above funded capacity. Second stage shelters are doing the same. And in many cases, they're doing so regularly, more than occasionally. That means that shelters are not just busy, they are structurally absorbing more demand than the system pays them to absorb. The reason is primarily tied to housing. Survivors are staying longer because there are fewer, safer, and affordable places for them to move into. And that keeps beds and units occupied for longer than intended. This also has a direct ripple effect. Longer stays means fewer openings, more turnaways, and more pressure on staff to manage complex situations. This is why capacity should be understood as a shelter issue and a housing issue at the same time. If we only look at the operational beds, we miss a larger point, which is that shelter occupancy is being shaped by a lack of viable housing pathways beyond shelter. In terms of the groups that are being served by our shelters, we find that shelter mandates have expanded, and it's important for us to understand the ways in which, shelters provide services. So most shelters still primarily serve survivors of intimate partner violence, but a significant number, sorry, excuse me. I need some water. Sorry. So a significant number also now support women and gender diverse people who experience trafficking, forced marriage, sexual exploitation, homelessness, and other forms of harm. That tells us that shelters are responding to community needs that extend beyond a narrow definition of gender-based violence crisis. At the same time, the report does show that targeted supports are uneven. Shelters are offering programming for children, older survivors, people with substance use concerns, and people with mental health needs. But they do not always have the same level of dedicated support for other survivors, such as Black survivors, disabled survivors, or unaccompanied youth. So this becomes a story about expansion under constraint. The sector is serving more people with more complex needs, but not with equal capacity across all populations. And of course, this directly ties into shelter programming. So what does shelter work actually look like in practice from what we heard from respondents? Shelters are not only offering a bed or a place to stay, they are delivering a full range of supports that help survivors move through crisis and towards stability. The most common services include referrals, risks and need assessment, counseling, advocacy, navigation, and case management. And most of these services still extend into housing, income, health, identification, legal support, and child welfare. So this is really about the shelter becoming a service hub, not just a residence. So this matters because it explains why shelter staff are often coordinating across multiple systems at once, while also responding to immediate safety needs. In other words, this slide shows the hidden complexity of the sector's everyday work. And speaking about shelter staff, the workforce response was one of the clearest signs of strain in the report. Across the sector, there are thousands of employees and volunteers supporting shelter work, but the numbers do not tell the whole story because stability remains a serious problem. Turnover and burnout are widespread, and low wages and benefits continue to make recruitment and retention difficult. At the same time, shelters are often in need of double staffing, which they find difficulty obtaining, especially where 24/7 coverage is needed. So this facet of the workforce issue is that shelters are supporting a highly skilled workforce that are managing increasingly complex situations. The issue is not whether shelters have people, the issue is whether they have enough stable, supported, and fairly compensated people to sustain the work well. That is why the workforce is central to the quality and the safety of the service that shelters provide. So a central contributory factor to strengthening the sector with respect to the workforce and operations of shelters is funding, which is why Robin will now take us through that particular issue as she continues our findings. Thank you.
Thanks for that start to sharing our findings, Chika. So the lack of funding was one of the top challenges, as I said earlier, that shelters are facing currently. And that's also consistent with what we heard through the 2019 study. As Chika noted earlier, many shelters are in need of repairs, yet they don't have the funds to undertake these. This is one of the biggest areas that shelters are forced to fundraise for. In addition, you can see on the slide that shelters are fundraising for basic operational needs like salaries and transportation. And this is a particularly significant challenge given that only 1/4 of respondents told us they had a dedicated fundraising staff person. So we know that that means that work is falling to overstretched and overburdened executive directors and other staff. The most difficult area to find funding for was for general operations and administration. I don't think that'll be a surprise to many of you. 23% of respondents indicated they'd cut or reduced programming in the previous 12 months. Given the role we had in distributing COVID response funds to shelters and hearing from them through the reporting on that funding, this isn't unsurprising to us, sadly, as shelters told us that without the continuation of the COVID relief funds, that they would need to cut staff, they would need to reduce programming, or they might even close their doors. And I think that we're starting to see this reflects the end of that funding now 2 years ago. Beyond the issue areas we talked about in the first survey, as I mentioned earlier, there were emergent or pressing issues that we asked some questions about. So the first of these was post-pandemic recovery. While we heard a lot through the reporting on the COVID funds, what we wanted to know was what does it still look like in this sort of whatever this post-COVID world we're in is. And what shelters told us was that overall, they're continuing to feel the effects. This is particularly true with ongoing high rates and severity of violence, worsened mental health of both staff and survivors, staffing issues, as Chika just mentioned, and increased demand for services. Not only are they feeling the effects of post-pandemic, but they're also feeling both the direct and indirect impacts of the climate crisis. So in the last 5 years, 19% felt the direct impacts of a climate event by having property damaged or having to evacuate due to an emergency. In just the last 3 years, another 21% felt the indirect impacts of a climate event by having to support those that were fleeing. So that was that they were accepting survivors from a community where there was a disaster and they were taking those people into their spaces. And lastly, in just the last 12 months, 45% had felt the indirect effects through things like heat alerts, poor air quality due to smoke, or issues with the water supply. And while many shelters do have emergency plans in place, 57%, that still meant that there were 42% that are in the process of developing one, that are planning for the development one, or have not yet started work on this. And what we heard from shelters is this is primarily because of a lack of resources and capacity to undertake those. And just one thing I want to mention with this is that during the time the survey was in the field, we heard from shelters in the prairie provinces that they may be unable to complete the survey as they were under evacuation orders due to wildfires. So we really felt and heard about the direct impacts that the climate crisis is having on shelters, even through this study. So substance use emerged as one of the foremost concerns that shelters indicated they're currently facing. Well, it's not a new issue. It has grown, with 83% of shelters indicating that people were using more substances, and a majority of shelters indicated that their community did not have the adequate resources to support those in need. Many organizations have implemented harm reduction policies to support those using substances, but we also heard from a large number of organizations that they didn't have the resources, training, and capacity to support this population adequately. You can see what some of the top harm reduction approaches that shelters are implementing on the slide. While we heard about some organizations that are implementing more intensive models that include things like on-site nurses, safe injection sites, creating harm reduction committees, we know that those are really resource-intensive options and policies and programs to follow, and they require staff time and expertise and funding, all of which we've shared throughout the survey, throughout the presentation of the survey, are in short supply for so many shelters. And I just want to note, external crises are a lived reality for Canadian violence against women shelters. And the data reveals a sector attempting to respond to emergencies with insufficient dedicated expertise, infrastructure, and funding. I'm now going to pass it over to Chika to close out this portion of our presentation with a discussion of our recommendations.
Thank you, Robin. So the recommendations contained in the report are a direct response to everything that we have just discussed in the findings. They are meant to stabilize the system where it is weakest and strengthen it where demand is already outpacing resources. So starting with the first recommendation, which talks about sustained capital investment in shelter infrastructure, we ask that, there is a longer term plan for capital investment, especially in remote northern and indigenous communities. The reason this is so important is that the report shows that shelters are operating in buildings that are aging, increasingly inaccessible, and often in need of repairs that shelters cannot afford to take on. This recommendation is not just about fixing buildings. It is about making sure that shelters are safe, accessible, and able to serve survivors with dignity. The recommendation also calls for new construction where needed, universal design, security measures, and solutions to jurisdictional gaps that prevent Indigenous shelters and unreserved facilities from accessing the capital that they need. To summarize, if shelters are to meet their current needs, the physical spaces they occupy have to be brought up to standard. The second recommendation addresses affordable housing and supportive options. This is central because the report shows that housing pressure is one of the biggest reasons survivors remain in shelter longer and why shelters are turning people away. The recommendation calls for stronger, capital and operational investment in housing, faster approvals, rezoning, land contributions, and the retrofitting and development of safe, affordable housing. It also emphasizes portable housing benefits, rent subsidies, and pathways to ownership as part of a broader housing response. The key point is that leaving shelter should mean moving towards safety and stability, but not entering another form of insecurity. So the third recommendation is about adequate, indexed, and reliable funding for shelter operations, the workforce, and inclusive programming. This is one of the strongest parts of the report because it makes clear that funding is not only about keeping the doors open, it is also about, whether shelters can retain staff, offer training, support well-being, and provide high-quality inclusive services. The recommendation calls for core operational funding that supports competitive wages and benefits, professional development, supervision, mental health support, and stable staffing. It also calls for a dedicated multi-year funding for culturally specific, indigenous-led, racialized, to SLGBTQIA+, disability, children's and youth programming, along with accessible communication support and interpretation tools. This is the model to keep in mind because it ties the funding to what shelters actually need in order to function well and inclusively. The fourth recommendation addresses external crises in a more focused way. The report is clear that shelters are responding to the opioid crisis, technology-facilitated gender-based violence, pandemic aftershocks, and climate-related emergencies, often without enough training, planning, or funding. So this recommendation is about resourcing shelters and community services to respond to those pressures in a structured way. That includes harm reduction, technology safety, cybersecurity, emergency preparedness, and the ability to recover when disruption happens. The point here is not that shelters should absorb every external crisis alone. The point is that the system needs to support them when these crises emerge. So the final recommendation in the report is to embed violence against women shelters within a coherent national gender-based violence framework. That means stronger coordination, more consistent service levels, and a clearer role for shelters in national policy and implementation. It also means reducing regional inequities so that access to safety and support is not determined so heavily by geography. This is the broadest recommendation within the report, but it is also the one that helps hold the others together. To pull all the recommendations together, because we recognize that they are individual, but they are also very connected. The report calls for better buildings, better housing pathways, stable funding, crisis-ready services, and a national framework that makes the whole system more coherent. That is the shift that the report is asking for. We're asking to move from short-term patchwork to long-term stability. Now, while we give us some time to think through our questions and, get ready to post them in the question box, we have gone ahead to post a poll, and out of the 5 recommendations that we proposed that you just listened to, we're asking which of these recommendations feel like the most pressing one for us to focus on, in your opinion.
Thanks, Chika. So we'll give folks a moment to review those and submit their answer. And I'll just remind everyone while you're doing that if you do have questions for Robin and Chika, we'll ask you to put those into the Q&A box specifically. So that's down at the bottom of your screen. And it should be sort of right beside the chat. You can click the Q&A box and submit your question there. So you're also welcome to do that while folks are answering the poll. And I do see folks in the chat wishing they could pick more than one answer, which unfortunately we can't do with this, the way the question is set up, but they are all important. So we'll just give folks another 10 seconds or so to answer. I see folks still putting in their responses there. All right, I'm gonna share those results back. There you go.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone who took the time to respond. Um, we can see that a majority has said that addressing the housing crisis and expanding second stage and longer term options should be a priority, followed by, adequate, reliable funding for operations, workforce, and inclusive, culturally grounded, accessible services. And I believe that these clearly reflect, the voices of the sector in the ways that, we've presented them in the report. And so we're going to then take some questions, and afterwards we're going to spend some time now saying, how do we do this through our work here at Women's Shelters Canada, and also invite you to, do that work with us as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. So, like Chika said, we're going to pause for some questions now before they jump back into the advocacy portion. So, we do have a question to start us off. Thank you for this excellent presentation. I will share the praise as well. And then can you share more details on the service quality findings? And if we need more information on what they're referring to,
Yeah,
we can
I think
ask
I
for
need
that.
a
Okay.
little bit more.
Yes.
Okay. So, Helena, maybe I'll ask you to submit another question with slightly more detail on which part of the findings you want more on. And we will also give linked to the last finding that you shared.
Okay. So the last finding was on the new issues. So service quality consistency. Okay. We're going
I'm
to
just
just
gonna
ask.
stop screen share for a second so that
Yes.
we can see each other.
Yes,
Yeah.
Kalina, thank you for that question. So we're going to just take a minute to ensure that we understand what particularly you want to get at. So, by any chance, could you be referring to the programming offered by shelters? Okay.
So
Case. Sorry, please go ahead, Leah.
yeah, just she's added case management and other services.
Okay. All right. I'm going to ask if Robin wants to
Yeah,
take
I can
this.
start.
Okay.
So, with that, we asked about a whole, and that's just a snapshot of some of the services we asked about that shelters offer. I think we provided like 30 different options for organizations to tell us. Those were some of the top types of services that shelters indicated that they did offer. Um, and that was that they always offer it versus things like we sometimes offer it. So those were the top ones we heard about. We didn't ask any more specifics than do you offer it? Do you sometimes offer it? Do you never offer this? Are there specifics you'd like to know, or are there other types of services like that shelters might offer that you're interested in hearing just a little bit more about with that?
So it sounds like she's added a bit. She's interested as well in any challenges that you heard about in terms of folks offering programming and particularly rights-based survivor-centered programming.
Chika, do you want to jump in with that? Because I think that came out in the qualitative answers, and
Yes.
you dove into
Yes.
those quite deeply.
Yeah. So, in terms of some of the things that we heard with respect to any limitations to being able to provide specific types of programming or services, a lot of them fell within, the limitations of funding and also staff, being able to provide staff that would provide specific services like translation, right? Or in the case where we had because we asked several questions about, the different categories of people, immigrants, people coming in with specific types of needs, and some of the feedback we got was we, other than staff, we can't afford to have maybe certain services provided round the clock. So where someone needed, if they were substance use, for example, you would require staff to at least be there in the event that, something came up. And so we saw that some people or some shelters responded with the limitations with being able to provide certain services based on the funding or based on the fact that they could not create room for staff to be available 24/7. Not to say that they don't do that. I'm just saying that it limited the amount of people. It would determine which particular survivors they could take on, which particular services they could provide to those survivors specifically. And so what we saw as a response to that is some shelters trying to refer specific types of survivors, if they could not provide a certain service to them, to other places or, reach out within their network to provide support in one shape or form. So I don't know if that answers your question, Kalina.
I'll just add briefly, we did hear a
Yes.
lot from organizations about the ways that they were seeing survivors come in experiencing like multiple challenges, or what we've heard from many shelters called complex cases. So that they do come in with a complex immigration status, that they're, experiencing mental health challenges or might be using substances, that they have a larger family. So all of those added to the amount of work that that staff were seeing. And because it's not just shelters that are feeling the strain and are feeling high rates of like high demand, that they're seeing when they try and refer to their community organizations, there are wait lists. And so they're taking on more of that work themselves as well. And we heard a lot about that through the qualitative answers in the survey.
Thank you. There's a question about the stat you shared in terms of 32% of shelters offering double staffing. And do you have any more? Is that sort of 24/7 double staffing? Is that an extra staff person at certain times to like bridge different shifts from 11 to 7, for example? If you have any more about that.
Do you want me to start, Chika? Do you want to?
Okay, you can
Just,
go.
we didn't ask a lot of details around that. So that was a part of a question we asked around the security that you had at your organization. And what we asked was, do you have all the security you could want? And if you don't, or what security mechanisms were you missing? And one of the major ones we heard that organizations needed and weren't able to fund was double staffing. So we didn't dive into exactly what that double staffing would look like, whether it was at any time, whether it was specifically overnights, whether it was to bridge shifts. But from the qualitative answers, this came up many times, that particularly those difficult to staff shifts like evenings, like weekends, double staffing was a big issue, and it created both a big security risk for staff and for residents, but also it was putting a burden on staff in terms of their mental health and well-being and workloads.
Awesome. Thank you. So we do have a couple more questions here. So with regard to complex situations, did anything come up in terms of security for both survivors and shelters when it comes to stalking and perpetrators trying to locate people in shelters or through community resources?
Um, the questions we asked with regard to security, also highlighted the fact that also highlighted the fact that people who, like survivors who were coming to the shelters, needed you know, security with respect to technology facilitated violence, technology facilitated gender-based violence. Um, they also needed, or rather, the shelters needed adequate help with, or not, let me not say adequate help. They also required resources in terms of the security systems that were being set up. But I'm going to give Robin a chance to respond to this because I think I need to review the question again. Thank you.
There was one specific question we asked about whether or not survivors were coming into shelter and an abuser had used a tracking service or something else on their phone to track a survivor, particularly to confidential locations. So we did ask about that. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the rates were relatively high, where a shelter with a confidential location had found that there was either spyware or a tracking something on a phone, a device, or something else on the survivor or on the survivor's child or on their technology that was using to affect a confidential location. We did hear about that. I believe it was in the vicinity of 25% to a third. What was more concerning was the number of shelters who didn't know if this was happening. And I think that speaks to the insidious nature of tech-facilitated gender-based violence, and it also speaks to the fact that this is an emerging area, and so shelters are building their knowledge, and that's something we're doing a lot to support at Women's Shelters Canada through our Tech Safety Canada project. But so we heard a little bit about that, but we didn't have a lot of questions specifically asking about the way stalking came into the shelter itself.
Awesome. Thank you. Did the survey or the report kind of find anything around food insecurity concerns when survivors are in shelters? The intersections of food insecurity and GBV is what this person will be doing their master's on, and they're interested to hear what's currently known.
Okay, so I will take this one for the team. Haha. Thanks, Robin. So yes, the survey and the report did touch on food insecurity, but mostly through like the cost of living, insecurity with, meeting basic needs right now, but not as a standalone question. The report does show that shelters are under heavy affordability strain. Food costs, of course, are emerging as an operational issue. And so this also inspired a forthcoming research, which Robin will still talk more about moving forward, Shelter Voices, where we now spend that, needed time, that required time to hear more about the issue of food insecurity, especially as it impacts how the shelters deliver services and how they're able to also cater to survivors. So I don't know if you want to add anything else, Robin.
Yeah, just Shelter Voices is a very short report that we produce annually. It's usually on a thematic area. So in the past, we've done things like asking specifically about the pandemic and how organizations in 2020 were doing, how organizations are navigating the housing crisis. And as Chica said, this year's theme will be on food security, and that's directly because we saw the ways that affordability emerged through this survey, and an area that we hadn't asked enough about. And I think it's sort of a microcosm for the broader issue of affordability is really food. And so that's why we want to dive into that more. So that that survey is going out in September, and then the report will be available in early November. And I will share a few more details as we talk about our next steps at the end of our presentation too.
Awesome. Thank you. So we have a couple more questions here, and then there's one or two that will lead us perfectly into the advocacy section, which is the next part of your presentation. So we'll just go through the next few first. Did anything come up in terms of what trainings might be needed to standardize care, or what workers feel they need more training on?
So I think with respect to how we asked the question on training, we focused more on whether there was funding for staff training and professional development. So some of the things we were looking at was DI training and maybe tech facilitated or technology facilitated gender-based violence. We also asked about I don't want to mispronounce it, naloxone. Is that the proper? Okay, naloxone, preparedness, emergency preparedness. So in terms of listing out specific trainings, I would say that in the data that we collected, we didn't have specific trainings that were listed out by the shelters. However, there was a strong, should I say, a strong emphasis on the fact that these trainings, both the ones that were listed within the survey itself, and of course, wider training for the sector was needed and required, which shelters are limited in offering because, again, due to funding. If there's not enough funding to ensure these trainings are happening, then staff will only have to make do with what they're trained for or what skills they have. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Robin.
Excellent. In terms of, because you were talking sort of in the beginning of the presentation, the stats around, capacity and how often shelters are at capacity. What came out in terms of how that impacts survivors needing like kind of immediate, in an immediate emergency, needing somewhere to go? Any practices around, are there beds sort of reserved for those urgent emergencies or anything around that?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah. Okay.
I'll say we were a little bit cautious about asking around this because there are a lot of concerns that organizations have around disclosing that they are that they maybe are using extra space or they're going above their capacity. We know that capacity falls in a number of ways, whether it's their funded or their actual. So we're always very cautious with these questions because we want organizations to feel comfortable responding. And we don't want them to feel like their funder might hear that they're going above or that they have these practices. With that said, we did ask, are you questions about whether or not shelters provide additional spaces on emergency basis. And what we heard is, and so those were things like, do you provide a cot or a crib? If, do you ever just open up your boardroom? And we heard from, I think about 12 to 15% of the shelters that they're doing that on at least a monthly basis. So it's happening. We didn't ask specifics. And again, that's because we don't want to dive into that too much, at least publicly disclose that too much because of concerns that shelters have, particularly with their funders and whether or not that might interact with their funders and their ongoing funding. So we know a little bit about it, but we didn't ask more in depth on any tactics they're particularly trying.
All right. And so, okay, a question around, was there anything that came out in terms of how shelters work with police, and particularly when an abuser is maybe reporting someone missing or sending police to shelters to look for someone, so sort of engaging, an abuser engaging with police to try to kind of, target a shelter, I guess.
From the report, we did not, and Robin, please feel free to jump in. We did not get specific feedback on how exactly shelters work with the police because the questions that we asked focused more on whether or not shelters, because we wanted to understand what the collaborative network was within the sector. So we asked more about whether shelters do in fact work with the police, but the extent to which or the nature of the relationship to the extent of whether or not, their reports made to the police was not something that we covered.
Mm-hmm. And with that question, we asked, it was a checkbox answer, but we asked basically, do you interact with the police? Do you have police on your board? Do you do training or education with the police? And there were a couple of other things. And then we said, no, we don't work with the police, or we try not to work with the police as much as possible. It was really about the partnership. And I will say most organizations are engaging with the police. Very few said, no, we don't engage. I don't have the exact numbers in front of us, but the majority do have a relationship with the police and are working with them. But we didn't have, I don't even think in our qualitative answers had organizations tell us more about that relationship.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks everyone. These have been great questions coming in. I'm going to ask the two remaining questions, and you can answer them sort of right here if you want, but I have a feeling they're going to lead perfectly into the advocacy section. So if you want to kind of just jump into that portion and get to the answers as you go, that's fine too. But we did have some folks asking about, our the recommendations sort of aimed at government at all levels, particularly around funding? Is that an ask of government? Are there considerations around, beyond government, other sources of funding? And then how are survey recommendations being used to advocate with government to make impact and changes in the sector? So I think that's going to lead nicely into your next piece.
I think it leads really well. I will maybe I'll give a little teaser and then I'll pass it to Chika to start on our second piece of our presentation. But the recommendations, so we will at the end of this talk exactly with how WSC is taking the recommendations forward in the ways we'll be working on them in the coming year. And some of the research that we'll be doing to build us even stronger evidence base. But the question around are the recommendations for all levels of government? We've made the recommendations fairly general, and as we walk through the advocacy guide shortly, what you'll see is we have created 2-pagers that can be adapted by your organization. I'll walk you through one of those in detail. And so that these recommendations can be tailored for what you need and your level of government you want to work with. For our purposes, these are tailored, the documents that you'll see, we've written them for the federal government, but we really think that these recommendations can be used at other government levels, and we're really excited to share how you might do that. But they are currently, in their current form, are federal, and that because that's our level of advocacy we'll be doing. And I'm going to pass it to Chika.
Thank you. So I'm going to just take us through what we'll be doing in the next section. I believe that this is a good place to reflect on the main message so far, given all the wonderful questions that we've just been through. So the message from everything we've discussed up till this point is that shelters are doing more, serving more, and carrying more system strain than the current funding and policy environment supports. So as we move into the advocacy portion of this presentation, this is where we want you to understand, or we want to emphasize that the report's data gets translated into action here. So the recommendations which we went through before the questions are the policy backbone, and the next materials that we will go through are what help different audiences actually connect with the recommendations in the report. This shift matters because a report only becomes useful when people can carry its message into their own work. So now looking at some of the resources that accompany this report, we developed a set of resources alongside the report to help people translate the findings within the report into actionable items. So these tools are important because they make the findings usable for different audiences, whether that is internal planning, public communication, donor engagement, or government advocacy. We have the advocacy guide, the communications kit, and infographic resources, which are all on the Women's Shelters Canada's website. And we believe that links will also be provided in the chat for easy access. The guide includes audience-specific material. The communications kit and infographic provide clear, visual, and ready-to-use messages, helpful for social media, meetings, helpful for outreach, and quick reference. These resources to the report are important because they emphasize, as I said before, that the report is not only for reading, it is designed to be used. So Robin will now take us through the advocacy guide and the rest of the resources.
Thanks for that introduction, Chika. So I'm really excited to share this document. I think it's such an excellent tool. We know that shelters are busy and they don't necessarily have time to read a 70-page report as much as I'd love you all to take the time to read it. So we've tried to keep this simple and easy to adapt for your own work while also giving you key information from the report that you can take away and use. So this document provides information on how the research can be used with different audiences. So this includes internal and external audiences. We've included key stats of relevance for each of these audiences and then provided suggested messaging, discussion prompts, and tactics for how you might use this information. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, we've created 2-page sample briefs on each of our recommendations that you can adapt to meet with your own government officials. And so now I'm going to briefly walk you through how the guide can be used with each audience and show you what's in the guide. So I'm going to the guide goes through, it talks about staff and the board, your internal audiences, and then it moves on to the external audiences. So the first audience we focus on is staff. And we think that sharing the report with staff, and Anu mentioned this right off the top, but it can help validate their experiences and build a shared understanding of the broader challenges affecting the sector, while also creating space for discussions about how national trends can show up locally in your own space. So we've provided some key stats that you may want to highlight, as well as some messaging for how you might introduce the report to staff. Some actions we propose include questions to pose at a staff meeting, as well as how staff input could be used to influence organizational planning. For the board, you might use the report to inform governance, risk, and fundraising decisions, as well as to help boards understand the broader policy and funding landscape affecting the shelter sector. Again, we provide some key stats and and sample messaging for introducing the report. And the stats might help you to inform strategic planning and budget discussions that you have with your board. You can also equip board members with stats that they might use if they're engaging in donor or government meetings on behalf of your organization. So as I get into the next slide, you'll see a sample of what one of the sections looks like. And I'm going to walk you through this. So these are some of the external populations that you might be interested in communicating the results to. So I'm going to start with donors and the public, and this is actually a screenshot right from the guide, and this is what the advocacy guide looks like, and how you might use this specifically with donors and the general public. And each section really is laid out similarly to this. So for donors and the general public, you can use this information from the report to show the realities that shelters are facing. And we've highlighted some stats, again, you might want to share. We've provided sample messaging that you might use for donor email, fundraising appeals, social media posts, or community presentations. And that's that box sort of in the center of the screen grab that's light purple. The stats can be used in any of these types of donor appeals or messages. We also link in this document to our communications kit, and Chica mentioned that earlier, and that includes a range of messages that you can use or adapt to amplify the findings or the report itself. And if you're speaking with donors or the public, we also recommend pairing a national stat with the report with a concrete local example, because we know how powerful that can be. With media, you can use the report to offer local stories backed by national data. So again, we've provided relevant stats that can be paired with a human or a local angle that we know the media is so often looking for. We've provided a number of sample messages related to the key themes identified in the report that can be adapted for your own context. Some of our key actions we recommend are pitching a local story to a reporter or an editor. And again, we provide some sample text for how you might go through that process. We also provide an example of how you might use national data to pair with your own local experience. Finally, I'm going to talk about the section on how to use the report for government advocacy. So the report can be used to show government officials that shelters are essential, yet they're under strain. The data can be paired with policy asks to strengthen the asks that you're going into government with. Highlighting how trends in the report can show up in your own community can be really powerful and show a clear need for stable investment in shelters. So again, we've provided relevant stats that you might want to highlight, as well as sample messaging that can be used in letters, emails, submissions, and discussions with officials. We've also created a series of 5 government relations 2-pagers that you can bring to a meeting or you can share in your advocacy work. And I'll walk you through one of these 2-pagers on the next slide, but these can be absolutely adapted in any way that meets the work of your organization to add your own local, regional context and your own organizational details. So while we encourage you to reuse the report in the ways that meets the advocacy needs of your organization, we also know that we're stronger when we speak with a collective voice. So that's why we've created these materials related to our 5 recommendations that we think are really going to strengthen the sector across the country. But we also absolutely encourage you to use any of the information or the resources in a way that best meets the needs of your organization. So now I'll walk you through one of these 2-pagers, and a huge thank you to our comms team for all of these materials. But I think these are great and can be really powerful. So this is a 2-pager that you can use for government advocacy. All 5 of these can be found on the page that I believe has been shared in the chat and will be shared after through email. But there are 5 of these, each one tied to a recommendation. They're at the bottom of the study webpage. And if you click on these documents, they should automatically download, and then you can open them as a Word document. This one in particular is focused on addressing the housing crisis. And the yellow sections that are included here are places where we've added text to encourage you to adapt this document for your own use. I know that this text is very small. This is just to give you a sense of what these look like. So you may not be able to clearly read what's on the slide or read the content of the letter, but we've provided that link or we will provide that link, and you'll be able to read these in more detail for yourself. So how we start these is with an introduction to the issue, which we recommend that you adapt with provincial or territorial stats, or even more localized stats or information as is relevant to you. We then have our call to action. That's the text near the top of the first page that's in purple. And in this case, our call to action is we call on the government to address the housing crisis and expand second stage and longer term options. It goes on a little bit more than that. And that's followed by some bullet points that really add more detail to our call to action. So in this example, we're calling, we have that high level call, and then we have these sub bullets that are things like building at least 50,000 new rent geared to income or social housing units, and items like income and benefit policies that support survivors to maintain their housing after they leave shelters. The next yellow section under those bullets is a recommendation that organizations may want to include their own experience about affordable housing challenges. So things like turnaway rates or extending stays. And this doesn't have to be hard statistics. This can be anecdotal information that you know from doing this work every day. We then highlight some key stats from the report that show why our ask is important, and that's followed by highlighting the critical role of shelters. And so the question was asked earlier, and this is where I'll walk you through. This is designed for the federal level. We've directed this particular one to the Ministry of Housing, but you'll want to mention the specific department and/or the individual that you're targeting in this ask. Finally, we conclude with a paragraph about us, and obviously you'd want to adapt that with your own organizational information. So this is clearly branded with our colors, with our letterhead, but as I said, as it's a Word document, you can download it, you can adapt the design and the content to meet your own advocacy efforts. And honestly, if you're just trying to understand what might a letter like this look like, you can completely take this apart, but just use it as the structure for how you might do advocacy on any issue. And so I just want to let you know that at the end of the advocacy guide, after the government section, if you're unfamiliar with advocacy, we've concluded the guide with resources that can help you to understand that process, as well as tactics you may want to follow. So these explain the legislative process, how to work with media, guides on how to do advocacy and feminist law reform. And we also have included details of the new federal lobbying regulations, as there are new rules and you may need to understand these. So I think this was the other question, where are we going next with this? So I'm going to share a few of the ways we'll be using the data for our own advocacy, as well as how we'll be working specifically to advance the 5 recommendations that Chika spoke about earlier. And I'll also share a little bit of the directions we're looking at for some upcoming research that really responds to some of the gaps that we identified, like we mentioned, with food security being one area. So we'll be focusing on advocating for affordable housing expansion, including the expansion of longer-term shelter options like transitional housing. Through this, we'll also be focused on the need for capital investment in current housing shelter stock. These are actually 2 of our recommendations that we're putting forward in our federal pre-budget submission, which is due on May 22nd. In addition, the information we gained in this report is really going to help us complete our submission to the National Housing Council's review panel on housing accessibility. And this is an opportunity for individuals and organizations to speak to the challenges related to housing accessibility for people with disabilities, as well as to share recommendations. And I believe we have, if we're not sharing that in the chat, we can share that after, but anyone can become involved in that process, and it closes in mid-June. We'll continue to advocate for investment in the shelter sector at the federal level. Again, this is a recommendation in our pre-budget submission. We know that investment is critical to ensure the well-being of workers, and we've also been including discussion of that in our meeting with Wage in recent months. We know that organizations are being impacted increasingly by external crises. So we're hopeful that we'll be successful in being funded for a research collaborative on climate issues, which will help to expand our knowledge on these issues. Women's Shelters Canada also recently completed our community of practice on harm reduction, and we have a number of resources for shelters to better understand how to navigate this crisis, and this draws on the expertise that already exists across shelters in Canada, and so I believe we can share a link to those resources as well. We know that tech-facilitated gender-based violence is evolving, it's complex and emergent, and so funding and regulation are needed to prevent harms. We're looking at ways to engage in advocacy, and we will respond if bills like the Online Harms Bill are put forward again, which we're hearing some starts of those discussions. And also, if you're looking for more resources related to tech-facilitated gender-based violence, we're always growing these through our Tech Safety Canada project, which you can access through techsafety.ca. As I mentioned, we'll be doing Shelter Voices in fall 2026, and this year we'll be asking about food security issues, which we know is so deeply tied to affordability challenges, and that'll be released in early November. Finally, we'll continue to advocate for a robust national action plan to end gender-based violence. We're asking for the renewal for the next 5 years as this funding ends in March 2027. We're also advocating for greater transparency around funding decisions, as well as encouraging a plan that's more national in scope rather than provincial and territorial. Those are just some of our plans. We know we will also be responding to bills as they emerge, and there might be other things that come out through the year, but really we want to respond to these 5 recommendations we've put forward, and we're really hoping to see some movement in the coming years. We have one final poll, and this is also a chance for you to start to get your final questions into the Q&A box. We are just getting wrapped up, but we just want, now that I've spoken about some of the groups that are represented in the advocacy guide that you might want to share this information with, of the groups I mentioned: staff, board, donors, general public, media, and the government, who might you be most likely to outreach and use this guide to connect with?
Awesome. And I do see folks putting their answers in, so we'll give them a couple seconds to do that. And I'll just reiterate Robin's reminder to put your questions in the Q&A if you have them. And I'll also just say as well, because there's been a couple questions in the chat, just a reminder for folks, we will be sharing a copy of the presentation, a recording of today's session, and some of the, the links and resources we've been putting in the chat. We will send those out by email afterwards as well. It looks like most folks have answered, so I'll share those results back.
Oh, it's a real mix. Well, thank you for responding. We do hope this is useful. Never want to create a report that sits on a shelf. We really do want to, as Chika said, this needs to move into action. And so hope that this is useful to you as you move forward. So we're going to move to questions in a second, but thank you for being here today. We hope you have a better understanding of the report and how you can use the findings in your own work. I need to do some shout outs to our team here at Women's Shelters Canada. I know you've heard this at the top, but we couldn't do this without the amazing people we work with every day. The comms team and Anaretta for being just instrumental in getting this report to the finish line. We wouldn't be here for today's webinar if it wasn't for Leah and Nika and the folks on our Knowledge Exchange team. So just a huge thank you for all of their support. At some point, the whole team here at Women's Shelters Canada has provided feedback and support. So just a thank you to any of them that are online today. Thank you to our interpreters. You're so instrumental hiding in the background. So thank you for being here today. Once again, just absolutely need to thank our funder, the Royal LePage Shelter Foundation. Finding an organization to believe in our research and fund research is phenomenal and so rare. So thank you to them and thank you to Lisa. Lastly, we can't do any of this work without you. So thank you to all of the shelters, the ones who open our emails, respond to our surveys. Without you, there is no report. We know how busy you are. We know all the work you do. We saw it in the survey, but we see it every day in our work. And we really just want you to know how grateful that we are that you're able to contribute to our research. I know that we have a lot of audiences here today. So if you're interested in us coming and sharing this presentation with your team or your community, please be in touch. Our contacts are on the screen. Really happy to keep doing this and sharing this information, as well as just sharing the advocacy information. And now we have a bit more time for questions. So feel free to ask about anything, not just the advocacy guide and the resources. And once again, just thank you for being here.
Amazing. And thank you, Robin and Chika, for such a wonderful and informative presentation and for the report and the resources as well. If you want to pull the presentation down, we can see your lovely faces while we answer questions. We do have some questions in the Q&A, and keep putting those in there, folks, because we do have time to answer. So to start us off here, there's a question around are there ever recommendations made regarding the abusers instead of the victims? As much as we all do this work, the root problem never seems to be part of the solution. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I agree. We didn't put any recommendations forward. Partly that is because we do want the focus also to be on the shelters, because that's the focus of the work. But we know that it is important that we broaden this, and we know how much prevention work that shelters are doing. We heard that through the survey, and we've heard that through many past surveys. So we didn't put that recommendation forward here, but I think it does lie in the need for more funding for shelters broadly, because we know that work happens, and it is a critical piece of the National Action Plan to end gender-based violence. It lies under the prevention piece there. We did hear from shelters too that they do a lot of work with men, both men who experience violence and men who perpetrate violence. We know that work is happening, and we know it's an area where there often isn't a lot of funding, particularly going to feminist GBV groups.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm going to sort of group a couple questions together in terms of, in the advocacy work with the federal government that you talked about that WSC has been doing and will continue to do. Folks wondering kind of if we get a response or when we get a response from the government on these pieces, will we share that information? How would they sort of be able to know, stay informed about what's happening?
It's a great question. What else? The simple answer, we do post the work that we do on our website. So we do post if we're putting forward briefs to the federal government, or if we're putting forward documents like the pre-budget submission, we will put those there. But they aren't the answer you're actually asking for. That's just the work we've done. The part you want to know is, how do you know if we receive responses, if that's moving forward? We try and celebrate when there are wins, and we try and post those to our socials. We know those often can feel like they're few and far between. There's a lot of policy that is currently moving related to gender-based violence through the federal government right now. If you've been following, there's work on femicide, work on coercive control, pieces around bail reform, and many more. And so we are following those, and we can try to make sure that we're providing updates, particularly when those move to new stages. But I don't know that I have a great answer, but we can just do our best to make sure we're sharing the work we're doing as it moves forward.
Awesome, thank you. How often does a study like this occur? Is this going to be a regular thing?
It's a great question. It's a little bit for us. It's also very funding dependent, and you're looking at the entire research team. So projects like this are big undertakings. We would love it to be slightly more regular, maybe every 3 years rather than the gap that we had. So some of that'll depend on the funding we have in the future. But I think a 3-year goal would be really reasonable, and I think that would allow us to have those more regular checkpoints on the changes that are happening in the sector. And it's 2019 when the last study was released to 2026 now is a long time when you're looking at challenges that are emerging. We know in that 6-year window, and actually since it was 2017 when the one survey was developed versus 2025 when the second was, it was even almost closer to 10 years. And so the changes around technology, the changes around the environmental crisis, having an entire pandemic, those are really substantial. And I think having those a little closer together would allow us to monitor those more closely. But we do always try and have a variety of other ways to check in on where the sector's at. So that our regular Shelter Voices study, the communities of practice that fall under the knowledge exchange team are a way to do that. But we do hope that there's more ability to do this regularly.
Amazing. And maybe on that note, there's also a question around what other kind of projects or research you're working on after this, and are there ways for folks to get involved in the research work you do?
So I will start us off with the upcoming Shelter Voices, and then Robin can take us on other advocacy, any other advocacy pipelines that people can collaborate on. So with Shelter Voices, as Robin mentioned, we're going to be working on that in fall 2026. So in the should I say in the spirit of collaboration that we've always come to appreciate from the sector, we will be asking, shelters to let us know, their experience when it comes to food security, give us, the required insight that is needed so that this issue can be dealt with, or can be, you know, should I say the appropriate awareness can be brought to the issue, as we've always done through our work in Women's Shelters Canada, and the required advocacy following that. So we would say, in terms of the most pressing upcoming work, in which we required your continued collaboration and would appreciate it greatly, it would be with Shelter Voices. We intend to, our timelines right now, we intend to release in October 2026. So we would ask that you please expect that. We will definitely reach out, as always before, and we expect that your voices will be reflected through that work as well. So I will hand over to Robin.
Yeah, so answer Shelter Voices, open that email in September when you get it from us. So we have some things we're working on sort of figuring out, but one project we are hoping to explore a little bit more is diving into shelter models, understanding the different, just understanding what does emergency or crisis shelter look like, what is a second stage shelter or a transitional house. But within that, also understanding what are some unique models and interesting cases across the country and in other countries so that we can share that, and what learnings are there from that might be able to be shared across our sector. We were exploring that. It's very, very early days. We'll be doing a little bit more exploration of funding this summer and broadly for the feminist sector, thinking about funding and funding challenges. And so in terms of the models piece, you might be hearing from us over the next probably 6 months to a year on that project. And I mean, Chica and I are deeply curious people, and we are have lots of other things that we're sort of percolating away on, but those are the ones that we know are sort of forthcoming.
Very exciting. Thank you. Those are all of the questions that we have at the moment, although I am going to give folks another minute to put things in here. There's always something that pops in right at the end when I think, oh yeah, see, there's always something that comes in. Is there a newsletter or a way to find out more updates on the research around shelter models? How will folks know when that's coming through?
Yeah, so sign up for our newsletter. It's available on our website, and maybe we can share a link to that either in the chat or in the email when it comes out after. Sign up for our newsletter. We always share when there are ways to get involved in any of our projects, including our communities of practice, any of the webinars we have coming up. This is my wrap up plug, I guess, Leah. So you can sign up for our newsletter. That'll also let you know. And there was a question about what we'd be doing around advocacy, but that's also a way to keep in touch with us and know what we're up to broadly.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so I've just put our website in the chat there. So that's just to our main homepage there. But in the website, you'll see, of course, the report, the advocacy guide, but you can also find a newsletter sign up on the events page. You'll see other upcoming events, as Robin said. So that's in the chat there now. Thank you so much, everyone. And we'll be sharing more by email very shortly once it's ready. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.